All right, I'm recording. Thank you so much. All right, sorry about that. Sorry for making you guys go on and on. And of course, oh, I see now now I see the chat is showing up. Everyone's yelling record, 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 Todd. Okay, thank you. Okay, let's try this again. All right. So, is there convergence in the developed world, right? So what this graph is looking at is looking among rich countries. Here's how rich they are in 1960. That's what we're plotting here. Notice that this is just a regular scale. This isn't a ratio scale. It's just regular scale. And then here is how fast countries have grown since 1960. Notice that if we look among rich countries, we see that richer countries in 1960 grew slower, and poorer countries in 1960 grew faster. That's convergence. Okay, so there has been convergence amongst rich countries, just like the Solow model would predict. Because once again, the Solow model predicts convergence because of diminishing marginal returns. Richer countries should go slower because they have stronger diminishing marginal returns, and poorer countries grow faster because they have less diminishing marginal returns set in. However, this graph is probably not the best way to think about convergence because there's some selection bias here. And what is the selection bias? The selection bias is that these are countries that are rich, right? If we only look at rich countries, we're probably picking countries that already have a pretty high level of productivity, that already have pretty high levels of human capital, probably already have high savings rates. We really need to look at the world as a whole. And what happens if we look at the same convergence graph using a bigger selection of countries? Well, now this looks a lot less like convergence, right? We don't see this strong negative relationship between how rich you were in 1960 and how fast you've grown since then. Particularly, what's the problem with convergence across the entire world? It's this group of countries down here in the corner, right? There's a ton of countries down here that were poor in 1960 and haven't grown since then. So in other words, there are some countries that are converging, but then we have a lot of countries that are not converging. And those countries that are not converging are just the poor countries, right? And if you actually can see in this graph, which countries are we talking about? We're talking about a lot of sub-Saharan African countries, some Caribbean countries, some countries in South America, right? Countries that were poor in 1960 and simply have not grown since. And so why isn't convergence holding? Well, I think the key is to understand how convergence holds in the Solow model. Convergence in the Solow model is conditional convergence, right? You're only going to converge if you have the same steady state. And to have the same steady state, it basically means you have to have the same depreciation rate, you have to have the same savings rate, you have to have the same productivity rate. But if you don't have convergence, if you don't have the same steady states, you're not going to have convergence. And so, the sad thing about this is that many of these countries, they're not converging because they're already at their steady state. It is a very, very low steady state. So if I can show you a graph here. Okay. Can you guys see my iPad screen? One more time. Sorry. I think maybe my connection's a little off. Okay, here we go. So think about a Solow diagram here. Okay. think about this being the situation for rich countries. They have a much higher they have a much higher steady state because they have a higher savings rate, and they have a high productivity level, right? So they have a much higher steady state. But what happens if poor countries are down here? And why do they have such a lower steady state? Because they have much lower levels of savings and much lower levels of productivity. So notice here that these countries are not going to converge over time. Poor countries are going to basically converge to their poor steady state, and rich countries will converge to the rich steady state, and they won't get closer together over time. Now, if something happens to change productivity or savings in the poor country, in other words, if something happens that moves their steady state to the steady state of a rich country, then yes, they can converge. But something's going to happen to change their level of savings or their levels of productivity. And so what is that something that has to happen? Well, this is probably related to what we talked about yesterday, institutions, right? Countries who have growth miracles have to change their institutions. When they have institutions that incentivize production over theft, then they'll see their savings rate go up, they'll see their productivity go up, they'll move to a higher steady state, and they'll start to grow and converge. But many countries have such such poor levels of institutions that they're stuck with low savings rates and low levels of productivity, and they're stuck with low steady states, and so they won't converge. And so this is how you have to kind of think about growth miracles and growth disasters. Growth miracles happen when countries change their institutions, increase their steady state, and as a result can grow very quickly and begin to catch up with the rest of the world. So those countries that undergo growth miracles begin to converge. But the flip side is what happens in growth disasters. Growth disasters is when countries see deterioration in their steady states, they see declines in their productivity and their savings rates, they stay stuck in low steady states, and they never have that takeoff, right? They never have that takeoff. They just stay at basically the same level of per capita output with very little growth. Okay, so you really have to kind of think about growth miracles and growth disasters as being the flip sides of two coins. Do you have productive institutions that encourage a high steady state and fast growth and convergence? Or do you have poor institutions that don't encourage savings and productivity, and as a result, don't allow you to converge, in fact, allow you to diverge from the rest of the developed world? So, just to conclude here, in chapter 5 here, let's kind of talk about the strengths of the Solow model. Right? Why does this Solow model play such a big role in economic thinking, right? Why is the Solow model still one of the cornerstone models that every economist, when they go through intermediate macro, has to talk about? Well, first off, the Solow model explains differences in per capita GDP pretty well. And what the Solow model says is that most of the differences in per capita GDP across countries is because of differences in productivity, differences in A. Differences in A explain about 90% of the differences in income across countries. Differences in investment and capital explains a relatively small part of it. And that's because of diminishing marginal returns. Right? Diminishing marginal returns means that capital is only going to explain a relatively small portion of differences in income. The second strength of the Solow model is what we just talked about here, that the Solow model helps us understand growth miracles and growth disasters. It helps us understand convergence and divergence, right? And this goes back to what we were talking about yesterday, changes in institutions. Institutions that create the incentive for people to make investments in human capital and in physical capital, and in technology are going to lead to high S, high A, cause you to be on a higher steady state, and they're going to allow you to grow faster. Growth, though, because of capital, doesn't last forever, right? Growth because of capital alone does not last forever. In fact, what we see is that as countries get richer, they will start to slow down. They will start to slow down. And so I want to share with you, I think I have this pulled up. Sorry. Shoot, I'll forget it. I thought I had a graph to show you about this, but I somehow forgot to pull it up. But anyway, so the Solow model helps us understand growth miracles and growth disasters is basically changes in your steady state that allow you to grow fast. Now, here's the third thing. In the long run, growth is only caused by changes in A. So notice that in our steady state, there's no way that we can grow. Once we get to the steady state, our growth goes to zero. And so how are we going to explain growth in the Solow model? It has to be that our steady state is always changing. And what could be driving those changes in their steady state? It has to be by changes in A. And so that's, in essence, the weakness of the Solow model and also its strength. The Solow model says that A is really important, but yet the Solow model says nothing about where changes in A come from, right? The Solow model treats A as exogenous, as productivity as exogenous. So if we're going to grow in the long run, that means constantly changing our steady state, up and up and up. And the only way you can do that in this model is by increasing A. But yet the Solow model says nothing about how that happens, okay? And so, the Solow model, there's kind of this weird dichotomy in that it says A is all important, yet I can't tell you anything about it, right? And so that obviously is a strength of the Solow model in identifying productivity as the key to growth, but also a weakness because it doesn't tell us much about where productivity comes from. And so that's basically the next step. The Solow model has allowed us to kind of take our simple model and introduce dynamics and time to it and begin to think about growth and income levels and how they change over time and the importance of diminishing marginal returns. But it leaves this huge hole out there. And how are we going to explain productivity, right? How does productivity go up over time, right? How can we begin to understand that? And so that's where we're going to move into chapter 6 when we talk about ideas. Okay, so that's chapter 5. Before we go into chapter 6, let's take 5 minutes. We'll do one of our goofy card games, okay? All right. I am picking from this time, which would you choose? This is always a little dangerous, right? Picking randomly. Here we go. I actually am going to edit these cards because some of the I don't want to do some of these. Okay, all right. This is a good one. This is a good one. Which would you choose? Season tickets to your favorite sports team because they lose every game you attend? Or you can never watch your favorite sports team again, but they always win? Okay, did you get the choice here? So you can either get season tickets to your favorite team, but every time you go, they're going to lose, or you can never watch your team again, but they're going to win all the time. As a Browns fan, this is a very, very interesting question for me. All right, let me give you a couple of minutes. I'll kind of break you randomly into groups, and you kind of decide this. This is, I mean, you want to talk about an existential question about the meaning of life. This question is right there, right? Would you never see your team, but yet they always win, or do you want to see them and they always lose? Wow, that's a mind bender. Okay, good luck. Discuss. All right, here comes everybody back. All right, let's have reports. Who who would have preferred to go to every game and watch their team win, watch their team lose? Raise your hand. Whoa, only Carson? Only Carson. You are a weird one, Carson. and so all the rest of you would have preferred never to go to a game, but your team wins. I don't know. To me,
Right. At the same time, I picked having to not watch them and have them win every time. What I would do is I would bet on the team winning, take the over and the parlay, and then make money every Sunday. That was the immediate thought.
And you're in an economics class. That really surprises me, Ian. Right? that's cold-hearted monetary calculation right there. The problem with never going to see your team win is it's kind of like if a tree falls in a forest and nobody's there, does it make a sound, right? If you never get to actually watch your team win, does it give you any sort of sense of satisfaction? I don't know. I mean,
When I'm able to buy that PS5 in November, I'll take the hit.
you're all about the dough, man. All about the dough. If it don't make dollar, it don't make sense, right? I have to say, Carson, I'm kind of with you, right? And once again, this is really coming to me as a Browns fan. I've spent most of my life just watching the Browns lose and lose and lose. It's actually okay. I mean, I'm happier now that they're kind of winning this season, but you can get a lot of enjoyment out of watching a team lose. So I would kind of miss watching them lose more than I would miss not seeing them at all. So, but
Yeah, are they even your team if you don't watch them?
I'm with you, man. I mean, like I said, this is a deeply existential question. Can you actually be a fan of that team if you never watch them? Right?
But then wouldn't it be like boring to go to the games if you know they're gonna lose?
I mean, once again, as a Browns fan, no. You get drunk and you throw stuff at people, right? That's a lot of fun. As a Browns fan, that's why we fill our pockets with batteries before we go to the game, right? Because we have to make our own fun by clocking the players on the field. So, all right. Well, very, very good. That was a good question. That's a good question. It makes me wonder about a couple of you, but it's a good question. Okay, let's get on to the rest of our business here. So we're going to talk about chapter 6, right? We're going to talk about chapter 6, which is about the economics of ideas and growth, right? We know that productivity is important, and we know that productivity is closely tied to technology. But we, in the first 2 miles that we talked about, we had nothing to say about where productivity comes from, where technology comes from, how it improves over time. We had nothing to say about that. And so that's what we're going to, at least kind of introduce here in chapter 9 is a simple model that helps us kind of think about how we might think about thinking, right? If that makes sense. So let me share my iPad screen here. Okay. All right. Chapter 6, ideas and growth. What do we mean by ideas? When we use the word idea here, we're basically just talking about a change in technology. Now, when I use the word technology, or when economists use the word technology, I think it's important to be really clear that we're using this word in the broadest of senses. Probably when you hear the word technology, you're thinking about your cell phone or your computer. But when economists talk about technology, we're really talking about a number of different things. We are talking about invention, right? Meaning completely new ways of doing things. But even more important than invention is innovation. So while invention is new ways of doing things, innovation is taking existing methods and applying them to different applications, right? So innovation is basically taking existing inventions and using them in a new way. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that when you really think about where technology comes from, innovation is really the much, much more important part of technology than invention. Right? Know-how, for lack of a better word. Knowing how to do things safely, efficiently. Organization. Organization is a crucial component of technology. We think back to Henry Ford's assembly line, right? There was no new invention there. Really, the assembly line was simply an innovation related to how we're going to organize production. Instead of having people move around and the product stays steady, we're going to keep the people steady and we're going to move the product around. It doesn't seem like that fantastic of an idea, but in terms of increasing productivity, it was monstrous, right? Global supply chains would be the modern example of that, right? The ability to have little bits of product produced across the globe and then to create supply chains by which we can bring all those things together and put them together and then get them to where they need to be delivered is an incredibly complex organizational task. And so nothing in a global supply chain is something that hasn't existed for decades, right? The new invention, the new technology here is really putting it all together, right? Putting it all together and getting it to work in a logical and reliable way. And then sometimes technology is just instructions. Or recipes, right? It can be as simple as instructions or recipes. So technology, when I use the word technology, and when I talk about ideas, I'm using this in the broadest possible sense, right? Not always talking about something that has a physical manifestation, right? Like a computer or a cell phone. Oftentimes these are just purely, there is no physical representation. They are purely ideas, right? They're purely new ways of thinking about doing things, right? So how do we think about technology and where ideas come from? Well, I'm going to give you a flow chart here. Right? Ideas are closely associated with the idea of non-rivalry. And I'll explain what that means in a minute. Non-rivalry is closely associated with positive externalities. Positive externalities are closely associated with the idea of fixed costs and economies of scale. And fixed costs and economies of scale are closely associated with imperfect competition. So I'm going to make an argument here that you really can't think about the creation of ideas unless you move towards thinking about imperfectly competitive markets. That the production of ideas is the production of most ideas is not consistent with perfectly competitive markets. And so this is one of the reasons why the Solow model cannot really explain the production of ideas, because it is a model of perfect competition, right? It's a model of perfect competition. You have to think about a model where there's some sort of market failure if you're going to think about where ideas come from. Okay, so let me put a little flesh on these bones, right? If this flow chart is kind of the bones of my argument, let me kind of explain these individually. Ideas mean non-rivalry. Okay, what do I mean by non-rivalry? A good is non-rivalrous if many people can use it at the same time without impacting on other people's use of it. Okay, let me say that again. A good is non-rivalrous if many people can use it at the same time without impacting other people's use of it. Okay, a hamburger is rivalrous. Right? If I'm eating a hamburger, that is going to impact on your use of a hamburger, that same hamburger, right? A car is rivalrous. If I'm driving the car, that's going to impact on your use of the car, right? Many, many goods in economics are rivalrous, but ideas are not rivalrous. If you have an idea and you use it, I can take that idea and use it the same, and it's not necessarily going to impact your use of the idea, right? This is in part because many ideas are intangibles. They don't have a physical representation, and so that means that they're not rivalrous in the same way that many other goods and services are. Okay? So there's this quote from Thomas Jefferson, who Thomas Jefferson said, "He who receives an idea from me receives instruction himself without lessening mine, as he who lights his candle at mine receives light without darkening me," right? So Jefferson makes the analogy here between ideas and lighting a candle, right? I can take my candle that's lit and light your candle. It doesn't take away light from me. It just gives light to you. And that is one of the important aspects of ideas, right? Is that I can share ideas with you and it doesn't necessarily impact my use of the idea. Now, the fact that many goods are non-rivalrous, though, creates some problems, right? It's good. That's one of the great things about ideas, but it also tends to create some problems. The good thing about being non-rivalrous is that most ideas create positive externalities. Sorry, I don't know how I spelled externalities here. Right? Most ideas have positive externalities. We know what a positive externality is. If I create an idea, it's going to have positive impacts on you, right? So whenever a market activity creates a benefit that doesn't just impact the buyer and seller, it's going to have an impact. It has a positive impact on the third party. That's going to create a positive externality, right? So think about the idea of creating a vaccine for COVID, right? A vaccine for COVID is going to impact many more people than just the pharmaceutical company who develops it and the people who take the vaccine, right? So the pharmaceutical will make money, of course. Some people will take the vaccine and they'll get a benefit, but other people, even people who don't take the vaccine, are going to get a benefit from it, right? Because it's going to create some herd immunity. That's a classic example of a positive externality. Now, here's the problem. that positive externality creates huge incentives for some people not to get the vaccine, right? Some people are going to say, hey, I'm just going to free ride off of you. I'm not going to take the vaccine, and I'll just let everybody else take the vaccine, and I'll still get some immunity, right? So in other words, this is one of the hard things when you think about, the idea of creating a new COVID vaccine, is we want as many people to take it, and we want to try to discourage people from free riding, right? Basically taking that idea and using it for free. So ideas tend to create a lot of positive externalities. That is a good thing, but it's also a bad thing. It's a good thing because we all benefit, but it's a bad thing because many people have an incentive to free ride. And as a result, less ideas are going to be produced, right? Because less ideas that are optimal, because many people are simply not going to either pay for the idea or use the idea that could use it. There's something else that's going on with ideas, in that ideas are closely associated with the phenomena of fixed costs and of economies of scale. Okay, so let me talk about these. Fixed cost. What does fixed costs mean? Sorry. Sometimes this thing really freezes up and pisses the heck out of me. Let me try this again. Sorry about this. Okay, here we go. Keep on saying here we go, and then it doesn't work. Okay. All right, ideas and fixed costs. Why are ideas so closely associated with fixed costs? Well, you think about what happens with ideas, and for the most part, ideas need to be made one time. Ideas need to be made one time, and all, or at least most of the costs are upfront. All right, so we're talking about this COVID vaccine. Classic example of what's typical for many ideas. The costs of making a COVID vaccine are almost all going to be consumed or all be incurred upfront, right? So the cost of producing this vaccine and then having trials to test the vaccine and then to develop the processes to produce the vaccine, all of those costs are going to be incurred upfront by the pharmaceutical companies. Now, the government has helped cover some of those costs, right, to try to encourage more pharmaceutical companies to try to make a vaccine. But still, all of these pharmaceutical companies have incurred huge risk by taking huge costs up front, right? So they have large fixed costs. But then the marginal cost is essentially zero. And what I mean by that is, once you have the technology for the vaccine, how much is it going to cost to produce a dose of the vaccine? Probably very little, right? I don't know for sure, but probably the cost of producing an individual vial of the vaccine is going to be very small. So if you think about the cost structure for most ideas, God, this thing is so wonky. Here, sorry, let me start this again. Okay, so if you think about the cost structure for ideas, if you look at the quantity of the good produced and what's happening to average cost, it's like this. Average cost falls dramatically as you produce more of the good, because almost all of the costs are to produce that first unit, right? This is when you have large fixed costs and marginal cost is equal to 0. Your average cost is going to be steeply sloping downward, right? So almost all of your costs are incurred right up front, and then your average cost falls as you make more of the good. Okay. Now, when a good has a cost structure like this, we call this economies of scale. When average cost falls as the quantity of production goes up. So the average cost of the vaccine will constantly drop as long as we produce more and more and more of it. So this creates some very unusual economics. First off, in this kind of market, ideas are really only produced once. Doesn't make sense for us as a society to keep on producing the same ideas over and over and over again. No, because for each time we reproduce that idea, we incur these huge fixed costs. So we should only be producing these ideas one time, right? We should only be producing these ideas one time, right? Here's something else. Ideas will create benefits for society that are greater than the benefits for any individual. This is what a positive externality is. In fact, oftentimes it's been said that ideas leak and they match. And what do I mean by that? Ideas leak in the sense that when I create an idea, you can use it. And when you create an idea, I can use it. But they also match in the sense that when I create an idea, that might actually make some of the ideas that you have more useful, because my idea can feed off of your idea and vice versa. In other words, the creation of ideas is closely related to networking, right? The creation of new ideas almost always is related to the idea of networking. We have this idea, I don't know where this idea comes from, I think it's just part of our American culture, that somehow ideas are created by like this lone genius working by themselves who kind of develops all of this amazing stuff. And without them, the ideas would have never been created. That almost universally is not the way that ideas are created, right? So if we think about some of the great inventors of all time, Thomas Edison, right? Thomas Edison worked with a huge team of people. Edison was very good at taking individual credit for the ideas he helped produce, but in almost no case did Thomas Edison produce something by himself, right? It was actually huge networks of people, right? Same for people like Steve Jobs, right? Or Mark Zuckerberg, right? We want to act like these guys just kind of created these great ideas out of nowhere. But in fact, there were huge teams of people that work with them. Why? Because ideas leak and match, right? As an individual, we really have a hard time creating enough ideas. But when we create ideas in conjunction with other people, not only do we get to use their ideas, but our two ideas together actually make something much better. There's something else that's going on here, though. And this is the problem, as I talked about a minute ago. There's the problem of free riding. This thing is going to drive me crazy. Sorry, I wish this. Okay. So what was I saying? Oh, free riding. Let me write it again. Okay. Free riding takes place in many ways within the production of ideas. One way that it takes place is that no firm wants to incur all those fixed costs if everyone's just going to use their idea and not pay for it, right? So this is a big discouragement to making ideas. How do we get beyond that? Well, I mean, one way you can get beyond this is through patents. And one way you can think about what a patent does is it makes an idea rivalrous. In other words, if you're going to use the idea, you have to pay me for it. You cannot use it without my permission because then you're taking something away from me, right? So it's making it more like a private good in which you have to pay for. So I think we can understand the potential value of a patent, right? Because a patent is going to encourage those firms that make a good idea to profit from it, right? So for instance, it's hard to imagine many pharmaceutical companies would have invested the billions of dollars in making a COVID vaccine unless they had some promise that they were going to make some money at the end of it. And how are they going to make the money? Well, they're going to be able to patent it, right? And once they have patented, then you're going to have to pay for the privilege. Of course, let's also be clear that patents have bad things too. Patents also prevent ideas from leaking and matching. So if I have to pay you for the idea to use it, maybe I won't pay you, and maybe I won't use the idea. And so there's a trade-off here. I don't want to say that there's a very simple answer, but there's a trade-off. For those of you who are kind of interested in computers and information technology, one way you might think about these trade-off is to think about proprietary software versus open source software, right? Proprietary software is software that's owned by a company and you have to pay for the right to use it. So for instance, Microsoft Word or Windows would be a proprietary software. But then there's also open code software, which is basically free for anybody to use, and If you have an idea of how to make it better, you can do it, right? Open code software, open source software is completely created on the leaks and matches of individuals. But, you know, of course, those leaks and matches are limited because many people aren't paid for the improvements that they make in open source software. So, you know, when it gets down to the details, these are complicated questions, right? They're complicated questions, but just to know that this is so much more complicated than the production of most goods, because the economics of it are completely different, right? The economics of producing ideas are completely different from the economics of producing a hamburger, for instance, right? Because of the absolute difference, the fundamental difference in making ideas as opposed to making other goods, right? And then finally, ideas can be scaled in ways that most goods cannot. Right? Think Starbucks. Right? Every year across the globe, they're opening something like 10,000 Starbucks, right? Opening Starbucks all over the place, right? How in the world can an industry or a firm like Starbucks expand so quickly? Well, because Starbucks is really selling an idea, right? Starbucks is probably as much as an idea firm as Google is in many ways, right? Yes, there is a physical good produced, but Starbucks, as much as the physical goods, Starbucks is selling a notion of quality, a consistency, an experience, a way of doing business. And when you see a Starbucks, whether you're seeing a Starbucks in Mexico City or in Des Moines, you have an idea of what you're getting, right? So the fact that Starbucks is based on an idea allows it to expand its operations much, much quicker than most other firms can, right? So these ideas can be scaled. But it also creates monopoly. And this, of course, is the last part of that flow chart that I began this all with, is that it's hard to think about ideas separate from imperfect competition, right? In industries that focus in industries that are more ideas based, they are necessarily going to be imperfectly competitive, because only monopolists are going to make enough profits to cover fixed costs. Right? Why would you spend all the fixed costs in a perfectly competitive industry in which your profits are just going to be driven down to zero and you never cover your fixed costs? That would be stupid. The only way you're going to cover fixed costs is if you have profits. And profits mean imperfect competition. Okay? So, one of the big debates that's going on in American society is, look at the market power of all these social media firms and these technology firms. And many people are kind of surprised by the fact that these technology corporations have so much imperfect competition. They look so much like monopolists. But the fact of the matter is, if you understand the market structure of creating ideas, you understand that by necessity, right, firms that are heavily invested in technology are going to be closer to monopolies, or if not monopolies, monopolistic competition, right? And so monopoly or monopolistic competition really explains a lot of what goes on in the tech industry, because it's highly focused on ideas and innovation. So let me back up, because I think probably most of you know what I mean by monopolistic competition, but let me explain it. Monopolistic competition is when you have an industry with monopolies, but there are reasonable substitutes. right? A pure monopoly is one that produces a good at which there's no substitute. But a monopolistic competition market is a market in which you have monopolists, but there's a reasonable substitute. So for instance, you might think about Apple and Samsung as monopolistic competition. They're both monopolists in the sense that only Apple can make iPhones and only Samsung can make, Samsung phones. But then again, there's also a substitute for an iPhone, right? And that's a Samsung or an Android phone. So they're both monopolists, but they don't have quite the extent of the market power that a pure monopolist does. That's going to be a very, very common sort of market structure for any sort of industry that is heavily reliant upon ideas, right? And so the more that an industry is focused on innovation and ideas, the more likely you are to have imperfect competition. And so what does imperfect competition mean? Well, we know from our principles classes, this means higher prices. It means lower quantity, right? If I write all this down. It means higher prices, it means lower quantity, and it means big profits. And so there are necessarily going to be big trade-offs when it comes to the production of ideas, right? Because we need innovation, we need new ideas. But the problem is these ideas are going to tend to create other problems in markets like monopolistic competition or monopoly, in which there's going to be excessive profits. And so without getting into the detail, if you listen to our public discussion about, for instance, what should we do about Apple? What should we do about Google, right? These huge monopolists who have an increasing amount of power in our economy. And what do you see is that there's a lot of disagreement about what we should do about Google and Apple and Facebook and these other social media companies. And that's not surprising because these are difficult lines to draw. There's strong economics for allowing these companies to get bigger, right? Because the economics says that we shouldn't have many companies producing the same ideas because they all have huge economies of scale. So the economics say, yeah, we should have imperfect competition. We should have a lot of monopolies. That means we're going to produce more ideas. But it also means we're going to get a lot of the negative things associated with the monopolies, such as higher prices, lower quantity, bigger profits. In our society, bigger profits means more political power and all the negative externalities that are associated with that. So I'm not saying that these are easy questions to answer, but I'm saying that you begin to understand why there's such hard questions to answer if you think about the complicated economics behind producing ideas. And so that's what we kind of have to think about here in chapter 6 is how exactly can we incorporate this complexity of the economics behind ideas into a simple model. And that's what we're going to do tomorrow. Before I let you go, I just want to show you a little bit of data on the production of ideas, right? First off, I don't know if this is going to work, but I'll try to show this to you. I found this in a book yesterday. So I didn't actually get a copy, an ability, or didn't have a chance to put this on a PDF, but this was a book that was looking at the history of ideas. And so it said, the authors of this book said, well, here's an interesting way to think about how much productivity and technology has changed. Let's think about how much light you could buy for a day's worth of work. So if you worked an entire day and you took that money and you bought light, how much light could you buy? And so here's looking at a little figure. It's like very hard to see, but the first line here is in ancient Babylonia. And in ancient Babylonia, an entire day's worth of working would have bought you 10 minutes of light. I'll say that again. An entire day's worth of working would have bought you 10 minutes of light. The ancient world was very dark for a reason. Most people could not afford light, right? What happens if you move into the 1600s? In the 1600s, they developed the technology of whale oil. And using whale oil, an entire day's worth of work would have bought you 1 hour of light. Entire day's worth of work in the 1600s would have bought you 1 hour worth of light. How about with kerosene? Now we're moving into the 1800s. With kerosene, you could have worked an entire day to buy 5 hours worth of light. Okay? And then there's the modern light bulb. Any ideas how much light you can buy with a whole day's worth of working? You can buy about 20,000 hours, right? So if you put this on a graph, there is Babylonia, ancient Greece, that, and then here's the light bulb, right? Right? I mean, many, many orders of magnitude increase. And so that's exactly how technology changes our standards of living, right? That now, we don't think about spending money on light because light is, we're able to produce so much more light because it's gotten cheaper, right? It's gotten so much cheaper. Just to look at very quickly here, some other things on. Oh, wait, don't want to show you this. Other pieces of data. Okay. Technology explains many things that seemingly are difficult to understand at first blush. First off, notice how the price of raw materials have fallen as we've gotten richer. This is one of the things that people like Thomas Malthus predicted would go up in price, right? Because we have a fixed amount of raw materials. You hear this from people all the time. We only have so much oil. Shouldn't we be seeing the price of oil go up? No, in fact, what are we seeing? The price of oil is actually going down in real terms. Why is that? Technology. We're able to get much, much more energy and much more production out of a smaller and smaller amount of oil. So we see this here. This is just an index of all sorts of raw materials, which is including oil and metals and everything like that. And notice that the prices of these raw materials are falling over time. That's a direct relationship to technology. We're able to produce more with less. And that's maybe the easiest way to think about what technology is, figuring out ways to produce more with less. Something else is that technology, and talking about technology as a process of leaking and matching, tells us why cities are more innovative than rural areas. Because what's true about cities? There's more people to leak and match, and so there's more ideas in which people can share. So a city that is 10 times larger than another city is 17 times more innovative. A city that is 50 times bigger is 130 times more innovative, right? The bigger your city is, the more innovative it tends to be. And you can only understand that through the leaking and matching of ideas, right? I think I've showed you some of these figures before, right? Or I've shown you things that are like this, but this is a graph of where patents are produced across the world. And notice how few areas actually produce patents. They're produced in a relatively small amount of land. Why? Because that's where the people are. And that's where the most concentrated amounts of people are, where ideas are leaking and matching and creating the most ideas. Here's an amazing graph. This is looking at the United States and where college graduates lived, okay? So the darker areas mean that there's more college graduates living there. Now, this is a graph of the United States in 1970, okay? What do you think this graph looks like today? Remember, the whiter areas mean less college graduates. The darker areas mean more. What do you think this looks like today? right? Notice how most of America has hollowed out from college graduates. And it's not because we're producing less college graduates, we're producing many more. The thing is, where do college graduates locate? Where other college graduates live. And where do other college graduates live? In urban areas, right? And so you can see relative to 1970, right? There's many more very small dark areas, and then there's a vast amount of more white area. And this just reflects the fact that people locate to where other educated people are, because that's where your ideas can leak and match. You move to become part of a network. And so I don't think I'm probably going to surprise any of you when I say that most of you in this class, if not all of you, are going to go live in an urban area, because that's what we see out of college graduates. It's very unusual for college graduates not to go live in urban areas. Why? Well, because the economics of it are so strong, right? You get paid more in urban areas because you're more productive. And why are you more productive? Because you're likely to be creating more ideas if you surround yourself with other people who are educated and smart and creative and themselves can create new ideas, because the ideas you create together will be better, right? Just to show you just some other ideas or some other data here about how ideas leak and match. One of the reasons why the US is the world's richest country, or close to the world's richest country, is we are a hub of producing ideas, right? Here's looking at the world's top universities, and you'll notice 17 of the top 20 universities in the world are in the United States, right? This is where our comparative advantage is. Right? Higher education is a huge comparative advantage. And it's not just the top universities, but then it's all those liberal arts colleges. I'll include Cornell in this, right? That if you go to most other countries, right, we have a much, much deeper bench than most other countries do, right? Where most other countries will have 1 or 2 universities that are very good. In the US, we have thousands. Well, we have hundreds of universities and maybe close to 1,000 or more liberal arts schools that all can create a very high quality education. And so, you know, this is where America's comparative advantage is, right, in producing ideas. And so it's not surprising that if you look at data on brain drain, and that's brain drain can be measured as the likelihood that somebody that has a high education stays in your country. And not surprising, the US does very well on this. Our citizens who are highly educated tend to stay here. And then you see countries that have a real problem with brain drain, like Russia, South Africa, India, Philippines, Sweden, Colombia, China. Though I think the brain drain issue in China is diminishing over time as more and more Chinese people are, you know, as China gets richer, it's becoming more reason to stay in China as opposed to leave. But still, China has a pretty significant amount of brain drain. And so these are all things that keep these countries poor, right? Even when these countries can produce highly educated people, there's huge incentive for them to immigrate or migrate to other countries where they have more ideas. And so in this, the rich get richer and the poor get poor. And that will be an important part of what we talk about tomorrow, right? I'll kind of skip some of this other stuff, right? You're getting the figure. I could keep on showing you data, but you get the picture. So anyway, that's just kind of a little introduction to ideas and how we have to think about them. So tomorrow, what are we going to do? Tomorrow, we're going to talk about a model that helps incorporate some of what we talked about today into an attempt to try to help us explain differences in income and growth rates across countries. And that's going to be what we call the Romer model, okay? So tomorrow morning, we'll pick up with chapter 6, we'll talk about the Romer model. I'll also hopefully sometime before class tomorrow send you all your graded homework number 1s. Also after class today, I'll send you our agenda, and I'll also send you homework number 2, okay? So you can be looking for that, and you can begin that a little bit tonight. All right, everybody. Thanks for your attention. Appreciate it. Have a good evening.
You said we're going over the homework tomorrow, right?
We will go over it at some point tomorrow.
Okay.